Today, I'm going to tell you 3 stories about real people who had something totally unexpected and insane happen to them, think like stranger than fiction, that kind of thing, that not only changed their lives, but also in some of these cases, changed the lives of millions of other people too. Now, these stories are kind of a slight departure from what is considered normal on this channel. They're not that far off, but they're a little different. So if you like them, let us know in the comments and we will do more of them. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please put glitter in the like button's car vents so when they turn on their AC, it gets blown all over the inside of their car. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the afternoon of July 9th, 2001, a 13-year-old boy named Cody Clausen carried a bag of camping supplies through the woods near Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. Cody had come to the woods for a camping trip with his dad and his Boy Scout troop. But about 30 minutes earlier, he had broken off from the main group, they were over at camp, and he had hiked a couple of miles to his dad's truck to pick up some extra camping supplies. And now that he had those supplies, he had turned around and begun hiking back towards the rest of the group. As Cody hiked along, he kind of let his mind wander. He was thinking about what story he was going to tell that night around the campfire to impress the other Boy Scouts. But as he was thinking about it and kind of walking along, he started to realize that things didn't look familiar. And at some point, he started to wonder, why haven't I actually reached the campsite yet? And at that point, he stopped, he didn't panic, and he just kind of looked around and realized that he actually had left the path. He was not even in an area that he had seen before. And so being a Boy Scout, he kind of stayed calm and he just turned around and decided he would retrace his steps back to his dad's truck and start again. He would obviously be very late back to camp, but at least he'd come back in one piece. But as he retraced his steps, he really didn't know where he had come from, because again, he had sort of left the trail because his mind was wandering. And so before long, Cody realized he was totally lost, and he started to panic. Hours passed by as Cody frantically walked around the woods, calling out for help, but not hearing anybody calling back to him. And then as the sun began to set, he also noticed that storm clouds were rolling in. And so this situation was becoming dire very quickly. But he told himself, don't worry, my father and the Boy Scout troop, they clearly know by this point that I'm missing and they must be out looking for me. But Cody knew there was no telling how long it would take for them to find him. I mean, it could be hours or it could be days. Or, the thought was totally terrifying, but they might not find him at all. But at this point, Cody was able to calm himself down and tell himself hey, you're a Boy Scout, you can do this. You can at least stay out here, make a shelter, build a fire, and kind of just wait while someone comes to find you. That's all you can do at this point. And so he had his bag of supplies with him, and so he took it off and he dumped the contents out, and quickly he realized the contents of this bag were not going to help him. Certainly not going to help him build a fire or shelter. But worse than that was there also wasn't any food, and he barely had any water. So effectively, he had nothing. And then, of course, to make matters even worse, the sky suddenly let loose, and Cody was caught in a major thunderstorm. And so Cody rounded up whatever he could, threw it in his bag, and just started running in the dark through the trees as hail is pelting him, and it's thunder and lightning, and he's got no idea what he's gonna do. And then suddenly lightning flashes across the sky, and for a second, the forest is illuminated, and right up ahead of him is this cave. And so Cody runs into the cave and he takes shelter inside of it. It's pouring rain outside. It's so loud, it's so chaotic, and he's terrified. But now it's like his body just shuts down. He's so overwhelmed, he's so scared as he's laying there wondering, am I gonna die out here? That he just closes his eyes and passes out just from sheer exhaustion. The next morning, Cody woke up still sheltering inside of this cave. And the first thing he noticed is when he looked out into the woods was the storm had stopped, the rain had let up. And then the second thing he noticed was he heard the distinct sound of a helicopter flying somewhere nearby. Cody instantly ran out of the cave and looked up into the sky, and sure enough, there was this small helicopter flying around roughly in his area. And so using some of his Boy Scout training, he pulled off his belt and he used the metal buckle of his belt to reflect the sunlight back up at the pilot to get the pilot's attention. And it worked. He got the pilot clearly to notice him, and before long, he noticed the pilot hovering down lower and lower right over the tree line, looking for a place to land. And so Cody is so overjoyed, he's about to be saved. He grabs his stuff and just charges over roughly to the area where the pilot's trying to land, and by the time he gets in that vicinity, he sees the pilot actually touching down in a clearing. Cody can't believe it. It's only been one day and he's been found. And so Cody runs over to the helicopter, throws the door open, gets inside, and the pilot just turns around and says, "Good morning." And Cody, at first, doesn't really register what's happening here. He's only just completely relieved that he is going to survive. But then he kind of stops and looks at the pilot, and he can't believe who it is that's just rescued him. It would turn out, the night before, when Cody did not return to the camp, his father and the Boy Scout troop did contact authorities, and before long, a local search party was organized. And one of those people who volunteered to be a part of the search was an amateur pilot who lived in the area. That helicopter pilot was the one who found Cody 10 miles away from his Boy Scout troop's camp. When that pilot reunited Cody with his father, Cody's father naturally assumed that, given the trauma of the last 24 hours, that Cody would not want to rejoin the Boy Scout troop and continue this camping trip, that he would want to go home. But instead, Cody said, "No, I want to go back to the Boy Scout troop. I want to sit there and tell them what happened to me, because now I have a campfire story that they are not gonna believe." Cody had trekked 10 miles through the wilderness all alone, spent the night with bears out in a cave somewhere in the middle of a storm, and then ultimately got rescued by this amateur helicopter pilot who happened to be, at the time, one of the most famous people in the world. The amateur pilot was the actor who had played Han Solo in Star Wars, he was Indiana Jones, and had starred in several other major blockbuster movies. It was none other than Harrison Ford. You know that feeling when you just get totally immersed and lost inside of a story from start to finish? Well, that's exactly what Audible brings right to you. Whether you're stuck in traffic or hitting the gym or winding down after a long day, Audible always has a story that will bring you right in. Thrillers, fantasies, true crime, you name it, it's all there on Audible, all just a click of a play button away. So go unleash your adventurous side with Audible's vast library of entertainment. Sink into gripping titles that'll keep you guessing all the way to the very end. Also, you can discover exclusive Audible originals that you can't find anywhere else, and be the first to experience exciting new releases from your favorite authors. And if you're looking for a recommendation, maybe check out MrBallen's Presents The Graphic Stories. I hear that's a pretty good graphic novel, and they do have a really amazing audiobook. Check that one out. Discover stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Your next great adventure awaits with Audible. Start listening today when you sign up for a free 30-day trial at audible.com/MrBallen. Okay, back to the story. In September of 1954, a 14-year-old boy named Rich shuffled his way down the hallway of a children's hospital in England. He coughed and wheezed as he slowly walked down the hall next to other sick kids as they made their way towards the hospital's classroom. Now, Rich didn't know what kind of lesson he and the other kids were going to get today, but frankly, he didn't care. Anything was better than just sitting in his hospital room, bored out of his mind. So Rich was in the hospital because he was suffering from tuberculosis, which is an infectious lung disease. And over the past 10 weeks, he'd been bouncing around to different hospitals, and in fact, his condition was still so bad that this hospital had informed his parents that Rich might need to stay in the hospital for another 2 years. And as awful as this sounded to Rich, this actually was not the first time something like this had happened to him. When he was 6 years old, his appendix burst, and then he contracted an infection that left him in a coma for several weeks. And then when he came out of the coma, he had to recover in a hospital for nearly a year. And all this time in hospitals had really impacted Rich's life, in particular in terms of how far behind he had fallen in school. And because his family was not a well-off family, they couldn't afford to hire a tutor to kind of keep Rich up to speed. And so basically at this point, Rich's education consisted of, whatever random classes these hospitals he was staying in sporadically had. Whenever they hired a teacher to come in and teach basket weaving or, shop class, whatever was available, that was his education. So that day, when Rich walked into the hospital classroom, he did not have high expectations about what he would be taught that day. He figured it was just going to be some random class that he would sit through that at least was keeping him out of his hospital bedroom. But the instant he saw the teacher for the day and saw what was surrounding the teacher, he was really excited. Because all around the teacher were musical instruments. And Rich, as a kid, had always dreamed of playing the drum. He had seen one day in a Windows shop a drum set, and he had wanted it so badly, but his family didn't have the money to pay for it, so he had never had a chance to do it. But now it seemed like Rich was finally going to get his chance. And so when the teacher began handing out the instruments to the kids, Rich demanded that he get the drum set. He would not play anything else. And the teacher was like, okay. And so he was given the drum. And then that day, the teacher led the class, through a couple of basic songs, and Rich played the drum, and he and everybody else were objectively terrible, like the music was awful. But by the end of the class, Rich was totally revitalized here. I mean, he hadn't discovered some special new talent for playing the drums, but he had discovered that he had this amazing passion for playing the drum. It was like all he wanted to do now. And he figured that because he was going to be stuck in the hospital for the foreseeable future, he would just spend all of his time on practicing playing the drum. So the following day, Rich went into a closet in the hospital and he found these long sticks that were normally used for knitting, and they became his drumsticks. And for the next year and a half, Rich basically banged these makeshift drumsticks on anything he could to practice. And then also every few weeks, when the music teacher came back to the hospital, Rich would go to those classes and he would try to learn as much as he possibly could from the teacher. And that was basically his whole life, was those classes and banging on everything he could. Finally, in 1955, when Rich was 16 years old, he was released from the hospital. He was finally cured from tuberculosis. However, despite having his health back, it isn't like his life suddenly got a whole lot easier. It isn't like, he left the hospital and, magically became this amazing drummer and that was his life. Instead, his family was really struggling financially, and so Rich couldn't go back to school. He basically had to get a job in a factory and work full-time just to help support his family. And for Rich, he felt like that was the right thing to do. He didn't resent his family. This is what his life was. And what he did is he found joy, while he was working in grabbing makeshift drumsticks and just banging on stuff any chance he could. And he figured that that would be his life. He would just work and, find joy in drumming whenever he could. But Rich's outlook on life changed dramatically on Christmas of 1956, so a year after he'd left the hospital. Because on that Christmas, Rich's stepfather had secretly saved up all this extra money by working all these extra shifts and doing whatever he could to finally buy Rich his own drum set. To this point, Rich had not been able to have his own drum set. Everything was makeshift. And so that Christmas, he gets this drum kit, and Rich is like, this is the best gift I've ever been given. And he began practicing even more. And pretty quickly, he began playing with local bands every time he had time off. And before long, he became known as like a guy in town who was like one of the best drummers. And then shortly after that, right as Rich is kind of hitting his stride, being this kind of local celebrity, this local, very popular band fired their drummer. And so it made perfect sense that they approached Rich and said, hey, will you join our band? And Rich said, let's do it. By this point, Rich had become known by his stage name, Ringo Starr, and that band that recruited him was the Beatles. Around 11 a.m. on Sunday, October 20th, 1991, a 31-year-old man named Will woke up next to his wife in their home in Oakland, California. And the first thing Will noticed as soon as he was awake was the smell of smoke. Will got out of his bed and went to the window, and when he looked out, he could see there was this big plume of smoke coming from what looked like right outside of his neighborhood. And since he lived in California, where wildfires were unfortunately a common reality, he thought that's got to be a wildfire. So Will called 911 to report it, but the dispatcher told him that yes, that is a wildfire. It's on a mountainside, about 600 feet away from Will's house in his neighborhood. But they said the fire department was already all over it, and the smoke he was seeing was simply the leftover, after the fire had been put out. So no real threat here. And so after hearing this, Will's mind was put at ease. He thanked the dispatcher and hung up, and then he went about his normal morning routine. And as he brushed his teeth and took a shower, his mind began to wander towards work. So Will was a software developer, and he was in the middle of working on this video game about ants, like the insects, and how they go about building their homes. And Will was really excited about this game. But as Will left the bathroom and happened to look out the window that he looked out before and saw that plume of smoke out on the mountainside, any thoughts of his video game immediately vanished. Because now he was looking out and he saw this huge cloud of smoke that, in addition to being much bigger, there was also obvious flames licking up. Like, clearly the fire is not extinguished, and worse, it appeared the fire was moving in the direction of his neighborhood, and pretty quickly. And so Will immediately grabs the phone and he calls 911 again, and he reports that, hey, I'm seeing a fire here. And he could tell just from the dispatcher's voice that they were kind of surprised. They felt like the fire was under control. Like, what are you talking about? And so Will realized, like, based on this response, I can't afford to wait for help. I mean, it's unclear if they even know what's going on here, and this fire appears to be moving right towards me. And so after hanging up with the dispatcher, Will knew he had to act. And so Will runs to his wife, who by this point, she's looking out the window too, she's terrified, and they're like, what are we gonna do here? And they decide, we just gotta evacuate. Like, by this point, the fire is literally coming right towards them, the smoke is beginning to overwhelm them, and so they just grabbed a couple of bare necessities, they charged out of their house, and they're looking down the street, and again, the smoke by this point is kind of, making it hard to see, but they can see other neighbors are frantically getting in their cars to evacuate as well. And Will and his wife, they're about to speed off when they remember their neighbors had gone away for the weekend and they had left their old parents to look after their 2-year-old kid, and they didn't have a car. And so Will's like, oh my gosh, he runs next door, he pounds on the door, and the grandparents, they come out and they're scared as well. They have the 2-year-old, and Will's like, come on. They grabbed a couple of necessities, they hopped in Will's car, and before long, all of them were peeling down the road, evacuating. 1 week later, Will returned to his neighborhood. This time in the passenger seat of a police cruiser, because you needed an official escort to be able to go into this area because of how dangerous it was. There was debris everywhere. When the police officer stopped in front of Will's address and Will got out, he looked at where his house used to be and it was just gone. Like every other house in his neighborhood, it was completely leveled by this fire. That fire burned for 4 days, destroyed thousands of homes, including basically Will's entire neighborhood, and it killed 25 people. Will walked towards the rubble that used to be his home, and as he stood there surveying the area, he was hit with this epiphany. He didn't really care that he had lost all of his things, like everything he owned basically had been destroyed by this fire, but he just didn't care. Instead, all he cared about and all he was grateful for was his family. Like, they had survived, they'd escaped the fire. That's what mattered. And so as he's standing there, sort of a little bit numb to what's happened here, he looked down and he saw ants. Now remember, he was developing this video game about ants, and so had done tons of research about ants. And he saw these ants that definitely were destroyed by this fire as much as the people were. I mean, their colonies were all burnt up and destroyed as well. But he saw these ants, and what they were doing was gathering supplies and rebuilding, brick by brick. That's what they were doing. That's what ants do. They simply go forward and rebuild, no matter the tragedy. And this gave Will an idea. 9 years later, Will finally released his video game. But it was not the game he had been developing, the one about ants. Instead, it was inspired by the ants he saw marching through the rubble after this horrible fire. In this game he made, you could create characters like avatars who could live entire digital lives, complete with homes and neighbors and spouses and kids and friends, like it really was an actual universe in this game. But this game is not set in a perfect fantasy world. Instead, the universe that these characters live inside of is meant to mimic the real world that we live in, where tragedies can strike, and often do, sort of unpredictably. Death, destruction, wildfires, you name it, that's just kind of part of living in this world. And so in this game, characters periodically would just have horrible things happen to them, and they would have to rebuild, just like the ants had to rebuild, and just like Will and his family and everybody else affected by that fire. You just have to move forward and rebuild. Will's game wound up being a massive success, selling tens of millions of copies worldwide, and today hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people still play it. Will's full name was Will Wright, and the game he created was The Sims. In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, MrBallen's Presents Where Nightmares Live, is available for pre-order right now. It contains another 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, all based on real events. This was a passion project. It took a lot of time, a lot of people involved, from the artwork to the storytelling. I mean, this is a beautiful piece to add to your collection, so you gotta check it out. The book comes out on September 30th, but again, you can pre-order your copy at book.ballenstudios.com, or you can click the link in the description below. There are a limited number of hand-signed copies available, but those are gonna sell out very quickly. So please pre-order today, because remember, your nightmares are waiting. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, we're gonna cover 3 strange but true stories. Fair warning, the top story today is absolutely repulsive. So if that's not your thing, you've been warned. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, wait until the like button has left for their summer vacation, and while they're gone, completely decorate the interior and exterior of their house for Christmas. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the morning of September 23rd, 1839, an experienced sailor named Captain Brighton stood on the deck of his ship, which was traveling through the Drake Passage, which is located right along the northern coast of Antarctica. He and his crew had sailed here because they were professional whalers, and they had heard there was this massive population of whales in the Drake Passage that basically were untouched by humanity because basically nobody sailed this far. This was a freezing cold, very austere part of the world, kind of a dangerous place to be. But so far, Captain Brighton and his crew had not seen a single whale. And on top of that, the Drake Passage had proven to be as dangerous as expected. Just the previous night, the ocean around the ship had literally frozen, basically anchoring the ship in place. And so when this happened, Captain Brighton realized there was nothing they could even do about this. I mean, they were stuck. And if this didn't break up soon, they'd be stuck here all winter potentially, and it was unclear if they could actually survive that. But fortunately, also the previous night, this massive storm rolled in, which, that's dangerous in and of itself. But the severity of the storm was actually a good thing, because it broke up the ice around the ship and allowed Captain Brighton to sail away. And so now, that morning, the ocean was again, liquid, so they were able to move around, but Captain Brighton had a very difficult decision to make. Again, so far they have not caught any whales, and they've invested a lot of time and money to get out here. But, if he stayed out here much longer, he knew they could potentially get stranded again, and he just couldn't let that happen. And so he needed to decide if he was going to keep on sailing further into the Drake Passage to maybe find a couple whales, or leave now before it was too late. But as Captain Brighton weighed his options, he suddenly noticed something over the horizon. There was this dark shape. And at first, he actually thought he was hallucinating, because really, there's nothing else out here. It's just him and ocean and ice. That was it. But as he continued to stare in the direction of this dark object, which was actually getting closer to him, he realized it was a real thing, and in fact, it was another ship, which was really surprising, because again, nobody really comes out here. And so his instincts were, okay, this has got to be a rival whale ship. I mean, that's the only other people who would come out here. But as he continued to stare at the ship, as it got closer, he realized it was not a whale ship. It was actually a schooner, which is a ship designed for traveling. But as Captain Brighton stared at the schooner that was getting closer and closer, he saw it was in pretty rough shape. I mean, the hull and the sails were very tattered. I mean, there was something off about the ship. But Captain Brighton was thinking, hey, I know you can get trapped in the ice out here. It happened to them the night before. Maybe this crew has gotten trapped in the ice. They've been stuck out here for who knows how long. They could be in pretty rough shape. And Captain Brighton knew they actually did have, at least at that moment, quite a bit of supplies, at least some to spare. And so he called out to his men to ready a dinghy and get some supplies, because they were going to go over to this schooner and basically offer up some extra supplies and also check in on them and make sure they were okay. And so once the supplies were packaged up and put on the dinghy, Captain Brighton, along with 4 other men, hopped in the dinghy and they began paddling over to the schooner. And as they got closer, the waves were pretty bad, and so they're kind of jostling around, and the ship itself, the schooner, is also moving, and so that's moving up and down. But periodically, as they got closer, they'd be able to look into the portholes, which are like windows on the side of the schooner, and Captain Brighton could clearly see there were people inside of the schooner. He called out a few times, but it was windy and sort of loud, and he couldn't really tell if any of them heard him or if anybody called back. And so eventually, Captain Brighton and his crew, they got to the side of the schooner and they just climbed up the ladder and boarded the ship. And once they were on the ship, once they were on the deck of the schooner, they're looking around and everything was in working order, albeit sort of tattered and in rough shape. But the weird thing is nobody was out on deck. They had seen people in the portholes, which was inside the ship, but there was nobody above deck. And so Captain Brighton's thinking, okay, this is pretty weird here, but we clearly just need to go inside and talk to someone. And so Captain Brighton and his men walked across the deck to this door that led into the ship. It actually led into the captain's quarters, at least, based on basic ship construction, that's what they expected it to be. And so Captain Brighton, he gets to the door, he knocks and calls out, announces that they're here with supplies and just to make sure everybody is okay. But there's no answer. All they can hear is the slapping of the water against the ship. There's no voices, there's nothing. It's silent on the ship. And so Captain Brighton eventually just opens up this door, and sure enough, he looks into this dark space, and it's the captain's quarters. And there's a desk towards the back of this room, and there's a man sitting at the desk with his back to them. And so Captain Brighton, he takes a cautious step into the captain's quarters, and he calls out to this man who clearly appears to be the captain. But the man doesn't say or do anything. He's clearly focused on something at his desk. And so Captain Brighton exchanged a worried glance with his men and then just decided he would walk across the room and go physically interact with this guy and make sure he was okay and see what was going on here. And so slowly, Captain Brighton began walking across the room, and as he did, he called out a few more times to this man who appeared to be the captain, but he didn't get a response. And then finally, he was right behind the man, and he actually looked down and read what the man had been writing. This is what it said. Trapped by icebergs. Despite all efforts, the fire went out last night. No hope remains. However, as unsettling as that would be to read for anybody in this situation, what was the most unsettling part was actually what was written right above that journal entry. The date, January 17th, 1823. 16 years before. That captain and his entire crew were all dead, and had been for 16 years. They got trapped in the ice just like Captain Brighton had, but it didn't break up. They were stranded, and they all froze to death. And because it was so cold out in that part of the world, all their bodies were basically preserved in their final moments. And so the captain of the ship, before he died, was making an entry to say what happened. And then down below, when Captain Brighton and his men went to go look, they found people playing cards who had literally frozen to death while playing cards. They found a woman lying in her bed with her dog. That's how they froze to death. They found people in the dining hall and they died right where they were sitting. It was like all these people had been frozen in time for nearly 2 decades, just floating around in Drake's Passage. And basically nobody had found them until Captain Brighton. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. In honor of Mental Health Awareness Month, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the stigma around mental health support. For a lot of us, it sort of seems like the way society tells us how to deal with our problems is by ourselves and sort of quietly. That admitting to your issues and seeking the help you need sort of signals that you're weak or that you're not taking this opportunity to, build character. And that's totally false. However, it is undeniable, and studies have shown that most adults, at least in America, believe that these societal beliefs and sort of the stigma is the main thing keeping people from getting the mental health support that they need. In the past, I've talked about the fact that I began seeking out mental health support for myself back in 2017 when I left the military. And even though I really was objectively struggling, and I knew it, I knew I had issues, right? Despite that, I really struggled to reach out and get the help I needed because of this stigma. However, I did eventually decide that this was more important. I reached out, I got the help that I needed, and thank goodness I did, because honest to goodness, it saved my life. And so if you can relate to this and you have issues right now that maybe are sort of unresolved and you think maybe you could use some help, consider giving therapy a try. And a great therapy option that's highly accessible is BetterHelp. BetterHelp is entirely online, which makes it very accessible. It's easy to start. All you have to do is fill out a quick questionnaire online, and then in as little as a couple of days, you can be paired up with a licensed therapist. And then if at any point you don't align with your therapist, you can switch at no additional cost. Going to therapy is a sign of strength, not weakness. BetterHelp makes therapy simple with 10% off your first month to help you get started. Click the link in the description below or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. Okay, back to today's stories. On the night of May 20th, 1958, a young man named Ram Thapa walked towards the entrance of an abandoned airport in eastern India. He was trailing behind 3 other men. They were his boss, another employee of his boss, and then a friend of his boss. It was pitch black outside, and so all 4 men had flashlights. But Ram also had something else. He had a huge knife. So the reason they were there is Ram's boss was considering buying this airport. However, there were these rumors floating around that this airport was now haunted ever since being abandoned. In fact, people said, the old hangars and rusted out buildings were infested with ghosts. Now, Ram totally believed that this place really was haunted, but Ram's boss wanted to go and check it out, before he actually considered really buying this place. And so he had recruited these 3 other guys, Ram included, to go basically on a ghost hunt. And so going into this, Ram's boss and the 2 other men, they're sort of like, okay, this is intriguing. It's kind of funny that we're going on this ghost hunt. But Ram, he was terrified. He did not like the idea of going into this airport, especially at night. He fully believed there were ghosts out here. He had brought the knife along to protect himself from ghosts. But his boss was basically telling him that he had to go, and so Ram was there. And so Ram's boss reached the gate, he unlocked it, and pushed it open. And as it slowly swung open, it made this horrible creaking sound, and for the first time, all 4 men are getting an unobstructed view into the actual property. And it's totally, again, pitch black, and they're shining their lights inside, and all they see are just these old hangars and different big buildings and broken down planes, but there's no movement. It's totally dark and it's quiet. And so Ram's boss and the other 2 men, they're walking along, and Ram's in the back, and he's so uneasy, he feels practically sick to his stomach. Everywhere he looked, he would think that he saw a shadow, a ghost staring back at him, but he would shine the light and, nothing would be there. And so this whole time they're walking, he's totally on edge, and eventually they reach the actual runway. And when they got there, instead of shining their lights kind of straight out in front of them, because there was basically nothing out ahead of them, it was just, where planes go to take off and to land, they began shining their lights predominantly off to the side, where there was this huge hangar, and they were all shining their lights in the different windows to see if, anybody was inside of there. And so they're all kind of focused off to the side, and Ram, the whole time, he's totally terrified here. And as, his boss and his friends are kind of shining their lights over here, Ram takes his flashlight and he aims it straight out in front of them. And he sees maybe a couple 100 meters away, just off to the side of the runway, is what appears to be this floating orb. And immediately he keeps his light trained on this orb, and he signals to his boss and the others like, hey, look at this. And they all turn, and they're kind of like, joking around, and they shine their light, and they also see it. They see this floating orb. It made no sense. They noticed that there was not just this orb of light, but there was something below the orb of light, like on the ground. Something was moving, this grayish figure, or multiple figures were kind of like moving around right beneath this orb. But before any of them could say or do anything or react really in any way to whatever it was they were looking at, the dark figures right below the orb, as they're being illuminated by all their flashlights, it was like all of a sudden, whatever they were, they turned, and all these eyes glinted and looked directly back at Ram and his colleagues. And it was like something inside of Ram just clicked. He was so scared. He'd been terrified from the moment they got here, and the whole time he had been so primed to protect himself if he had to with this knife. And it was like when he saw these eyes, he didn't have any idea what they were, but he knew they were evil, and if he didn't act, they were doomed. And so, without saying anything to his boss or the other 2 men, With knife in hand, Rom took off running towards the figures. A few hours later, Rom and his colleagues were no longer at the airport. Instead, they were at the police station, and Rom was in handcuffs. It would turn out those figures that they spotted that Rom went to go confront with his knife were not actually ghosts. Instead, they were 3 women who had come onto the airfield as well, but just to pick flowers. That orb of light that the men had seen was just their lantern. Rom had been so convinced they were ghosts that he had taken off and attacked them with his knife, believing he was not only protecting himself, but protecting his boss and the other 2 men. However, he had been wrong. These were just women, and he killed one of them and severely wounded the other 2. And so ultimately, he was charged with murder and assault. However, when he went on trial, he was actually acquitted of all charges because the jury genuinely believed that Rom actually thought he was attacking ghosts, not people. On April 9th, 2005, in Kaohsiung City, Taiwan, a young man was home alone inside of his apartment watching TV. And as he sat there watching TV, he heard a loud thumping sound coming from right above him. As soon as he heard it, he muted his TV and he listened for a second, and a minute later, he heard it again, a loud thump. And then he heard another one, and another one, and another one, and before long, all he heard was a succession of thumps and also what sounded like chanting coming from upstairs. However, as unusual as these types of sounds might be to the average person, to this young man, these actually weren't that weird. Because the family that lived right above him, the Wu family, were pretty eccentric. They were very religious people who often did these ceremonial dances and rituals at all hours, and a lot of times they involved stomping around and chanting really loudly. And as annoying as that could be, this young man never complained. He was very respectful of the Wu family, and he knew, these sounds he was hearing were connected to their religion, and he felt like that was none of his business. And so, like he did basically every other time he would hear these noises, he simply turned the volume up on his TV and tried to forget about them. But after a few minutes, it was like the noises coming from upstairs just kept getting louder and louder and louder until it was basically impossible to ignore. And then suddenly he heard a scream coming from upstairs that certainly did not feel attached to a ceremony. It sounded like somebody was in danger or in trouble or something. And so at that point, the young man turned the TV off and he stood up and he thought, I need to go up there and make sure things are okay. I mean, forget being annoyed. It sounds like, someone's in trouble or someone's hurt or something. But as he began making his way towards his door to go upstairs and check on the Wu family, all the noises just completely stopped and it was silent upstairs. And at that point, the young man just stopped where he was. And for a minute, he just listened, waiting to see if maybe the noises would pick back up again. But they didn't. And so the young man just turned around, walked back to his seat, and turned the TV back on. 2 days later, on April 11th, that same young man was back home all alone, watching TV yet again, when, once again, he heard a loud pounding sound. Except this time, it was not coming from upstairs, it was coming from his front door. Somebody was hammering on his front door trying to get his attention. And so the young man turned off the TV, he got up, and he went over to his door, he opened it up, and standing there on the landing was this middle-aged man named Wu Shan, who was the patriarch of the Wu family upstairs. And Wu Shan looked absolutely horrible. He was dressed all in black head to toe, but he was pale and skinny and very gaunt, and he was covered in what looked like filth, like food and ash, and he smelled unbelievably horrible. And the young man, he asked Wu Shan, hey, is everything okay? And remember, the young man's thinking about that crazy, loud ceremony they had just 2 days earlier, wondering, whatever happened with that? That was so loud. But Wu Shan just looked back at the young man with this kind of vacant expression, and he just said, call an ambulance. And then, without saying anything else, Wu Shan turned, ran down the steps, and disappeared out into the street. And so at this point, the young man is left just standing there having no idea what to think. I mean, Wu Shan did not look well and he's now run away. And again, this young man is thinking about that bizarre ritual he overheard a couple of days ago that just kind of stopped abruptly after screams were heard. Now he's being told to call an ambulance. And so he's thinking, I better go upstairs and make sure things are okay before I do anything else. And so the young man left his apartment, went upstairs to the Wu family's apartment, and the door was shut. But even standing outside the door, he began to smell that same absolutely horrible smell that he smelled on Wu Shan. And so he knocks on the Wu family's door. He's kind of covering his nose, but he doesn't get a response. Nobody comes to the door. And so after looking around, he just tried the doorknob and he found it was unlocked. So, pretty apprehensively, but knowing he needed to see what was going on here, he opened up the door and right away he's hit with another wave of just this disgusting smell. He can barely breathe, but nonetheless, he steps into the house and he calls out to anybody, anyone come over here and tell me what's going on. But nobody called back. And he kind of looked around the family's apartment and it was totally filthy. There was just this grime all over everything. And he made his way all the way into the living room. And there he stopped because in the middle of the living room on the floor, he saw something that he just simply couldn't believe. It would turn out the Wu family had performed a ritual 2 days earlier. That was the sounds that the neighbor downstairs had been hearing. Those loud stomping and screaming, all that stuff was a ceremony like the family was known to do. However, that ceremony got totally out of hand. So in the weeks leading up to that ceremony, one of the Wu family's daughters came down with an illness. And because the family didn't have a lot of money, they couldn't send her to the doctor. And after a couple of days, when she didn't get better, the family decided that, okay, well, she must not be physically sick. She must be spiritually sick, meaning she was possessed by a demon. And so at first, they tried some ceremonies to ward off this demon, but it wasn't really working. And then before long, the rest of the members of the family began complaining that maybe they too were also possessed by the same demon. And before long, that was the belief that the entire Wu family shared, that they all were possessed by demons. And so on the day the downstairs neighbor heard all that stomping and chanting and screaming, that was the day that the Wu family performed a big group exorcism to try to get rid of these demons once and for all from all of them. But the way they did this exorcism was truly horrifying. They believed that the one thing demons were afraid of was filth. And so they decided that if they filled their bodies with enough filth, the demons would leave. And so the Wu family, as they chanted and stomped around and screamed, began consuming their own feces. And when they would vomit it back up again, they would just swallow it right back down for hours and hours and hours. What the downstairs neighbor actually discovered inside the living room of the Wu family's apartment was the daughter, the one who originally had gotten sick, and she was laying on the ground and was deceased. And during the autopsy, they would discover that her airway was totally blocked by feces and vomit. By the time the downstairs neighbor made this discovery, the entire Wu family had fled the apartment. Wu Shan had disappeared after saying calling an ambulance, and the rest of the family too had kind of run off. But the police would ultimately track down all the remaining Wu family members and they would all be arrested. However, a court ultimately decided that the Wu family was suffering from something known as mass hysteria. And as a result of that, they could not be held legally accountable for what they did. And so they were all acquitted. In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, MrBallen's Presents Where Nightmares Live, is available for pre-order right now. It contains another 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, all based on real events. This was a passion project. It took a lot of time, a lot of people involved, from the artwork to the storytelling. I mean, this is a beautiful piece to add to your collection, so you gotta check it out. The book comes out on September 30th, but again, you can pre-order your copy at book.ballenstudios.com, or you can click the link in the description below. There are a limited number of hand-signed copies available, but those are gonna sell out very quickly. So please pre-order today, because remember, your nightmares are waiting. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me,
খাসির মাংস আমি আনতে কইছিলাম আপনার লইগা, ভাবছিলাম মজা করে আপনারা রান্না খাওয়াবো। আমি এই সময় গোসল করি, আমি সকালবেলা গোসল ছেড়ে ফেলাই না। রিক্সা চালান বাদ দিয়া অন্য কিছু করন যায় না?
করন যায়, চুরি করন যায়, ডাকাতি করন যায়।
তুমি ইন্টারনেট চালাও না, তুমি সব বিষয় বুঝবাও না।
অত বুঝবার চাই না।
কাকা একটু খাসি মাংস দাম দেয় না?
খাসি মাংস নাই রে বাপ।
লাগবো না ছবি তোলা, লাগবো না আমার ছাগল।
এই তুই তুই কে?
পরে না জুতো নাই।
আরে হইছে ছাড়েন, আরে কেউ দেখা ভালাইবো। দূর
চায়ের ব্যবস্থা করে ফেলাইছো? দুধ পাইলা কই, চা পাতা পাইলা কই? আমার আনতে কইছিল, আমি তো আনি নাই। দিন আর দিনে খসিয়া পড়িবে। হুজুর নামাজ দিতেছেন? আপনার টুপির থেকে আমার টুপির দাম বেশি, বদলাইবেন?
কবে স্পেশাল হইছে?
হ্যাঁ,
আসলেই মজা হইছে, খালি লবণটা দিতে ভুলে গেছিলাম।
আমি আবার অপোজিট পছন্দ করি না।
এইটাই তো ভালো।
দিন আর দিনে খসিয়া পড়িবে। চেষ্টাটা যে করতে পারছি, সন্তান হয়ে বাপের চিকিৎসা যে করাইতে পারছি, এটাই শান্তি।
হ্যাঁ, রান্ধনের হাত খারাপ হইলেও মানে ঝামেলা থাকলেও খাসির মাংসটা ভালো রান্ধে। ভাবি যান, আইসেন।
তুই তো বড় বেহায়া রে, তুই তো এরকমের ছিলি না, তুই তো দিয়ে আমার গুনার বাকি করবি।
দান খয়রাত নিতে আমি পারবো না, আমার শরম করে।
আরে বাবা শরমের কি আছে?
আয় পায়েস খাওয়া যাবি।
অহন না, পরে আমন এখন যাই।
আইস কিন্তু
অনেক মানুষ আছে না আশের মতন ক্যাত ক্যাত করে গলা পর্যন্ত খায়, আমি পারি না। গরিবের বউ না তুমি, খাসি মাংস খাইতে পারতাছি না, 1 ঘন্টা ঘুরে আনি।
একটু হাসো, ফ্রি ফ্রি ছাগল পাইতাছো, সুইট করে হাসি দাও। ছেগাইয়া হাসতেছো কেন? একটু সুইট করে হাসো।
ও ভাবি, এত স্বাদের মাংস ফালাই দিলেন কেন? খাসির মাংস আমি আনতে কইছিলাম আপনার লইগা, ভাবছিলাম মজা করে আপনারা রান্না খাওয়াবো।
কোন রঙে বানাইয়াছ ঘর খানি